Welcome to Talk World Radio, a half-hour discussion of politics as if the people mattered. I'm David Swanson. This week on Talk World Radio, we welcome back Scott Horton, whose new book is called PROVOKED: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Scott Horton is director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of Antiwar.com, host of Antiwar Radio on Pacifica 90.7 FM KPFK in Los Angeles, California, and podcasts The Scott Horton Show from scotthorton.org. His books include Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, and Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. It's kind of an ending war theme going. Scott Horton, welcome back to Talk World Radio.
Thank you so much for having me, David. Great to be with you.
Scott, I have a confession to make. I have a rule. I never blurb a book without actually reading the whole thing, which I understand is bizarre and unheard of. And I've never before interviewed somebody about a book without having read the whole thing. But this thing is bigger than War and Peace and better. And I've read the bits about Bush Sr., Bush the Elder, and Bill Clinton. I haven't even got to my favorite mass murderer, George W. Bush. But I think we'll have to have you back for each few chapters because this thing is tremendous. The level of detail. I mean, this is a book not just to read, but to put on your shelf and go to anytime you need all the details on the war madness since Bush the Elder. So very well done.
Well, thank you very much for that. I know you're a real stickler too, so I take your praise very heavily.
Well, I'm leaving out the 10% that's about economics, which I have no use for whatsoever, and we probably don't need to talk about because we know what each other think. But the 90-something% that's about war and foreign policy and lies and disaster and killing is tremendously well done.
I think we could even find some common ground on the economic stuff, if you mean like the shock therapy during Bill Clinton. I bet we wouldn't agree on what should have been done instead, but I bet we would agree on how bad it was what Bill Clinton did. You know,
we agree everything's a tremendous disaster. We just don't agree on what to do about it. Russia got capitalism and the United States got oligarchs. They should be best buddies, but it's all a disaster.
They become more like us. We become more like them. What's the problem?
Yeah, exactly. But I want to talk about the story because a lot of this is the story of Ukraine, of recent years in Ukraine, traced back to where it all came from. That's supposedly ancient history, but it's actually the same damn people, right? Through the whole course of the thing. On like page 2 or 3, Condoleezza Rice, who many people don't even know was around back then, comes into the room and ruins everything, right?
Yeah, she was the, I guess, top Russia hand on the National Security Council at the time in the H.W. Bush administration. And right. I've actually got a new email pen pal here, Edward Lozansky, who's the founder of the American University in Moscow. And he's the one who told this story. He had teamed up with the conservative activist Paul Weyrich. And what had happened was, this is in, I believe, early 89. So maybe just after the wall came down, in late No, the wall comes down in 89. I always think it's 88, but it's 89. So this is before the wall came down. And some high-level Soviet apparatchiks under Gorbachev came and talked to Lozansky and Weyrich and said, listen, we're ready to just drop everything. We'll dissolve the Warsaw Pact and move west. We just want to join up with you and do one big thing with you guys, and let's do it. And according to, I believe it's Lozansky that tells the story, although I'm going to end up interviewing him about it, I guess, and get a firsthand account. But I believe it's Lozansky who was giving the pitch to Bush Sr., who was saying, man, this just sounds great. And then Condoleezza Rice walks in the room and goes, no. Don't listen to them. They don't know what they're talking about.
What was the pitch that sounded great, though?
Well, so this is actually what's interesting to me. I don't know about you and your audience, but this was the New World Order conspiracy theory in the 1990s that I believed in and was quite afraid of. That America and Russia were just like we were joking about. They become more like us. We become more like them. And we bring them into our military alliance and essentially create one white world army of the North to lord it over the global South. and that this would be, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And as some of the more powerful leftists in America had talked about since even World War I, but especially after World War II, creating a real world federal government under the United Nations. And with this one world army, in place of the current world order of sovereign nation states. And so what Russia was talking about doing, what the Soviets were talking about doing at the time, was basically that. Let's join your alliance. And the thing is about it, though, is there were softer versions of this that maybe wouldn't be acceptable to my pure non-interventionism, but would certainly have been a better way to travel down this road than the way that they did it. And that would have been, and this is what they talked about at the time, that listen, there's no enemy anymore, so we don't need an alliance anymore. Instead, we're just going to have a security partnership, and you guys will be part of it too. So it's not really an alliance, like, oh, if we ever have a problem with Iran, we go together against them or something like that. But it would just be whenever there are security issues in Europe, we deal together at the table, and we bring the Soviets to the same table where we've been dealing with our other allies this whole time, and it'll be fine. And in fact, as I show in the book, the Bush administration had no intention of breaking up the Soviet Union. They just wanted to see the Warsaw Pact dissolved and the Eastern European states that were not Soviet republics to be set free from Soviet domination. But they anticipated and in fact preferred that Ukraine and Belarus and the Central Asian stands, less Afghanistan, stay under the control of Moscow. And I even quote Brent Scowcroft sounding resentful against Yeltsin for finally destroying the Soviet Union in a conspiracy with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus to just shift all the power away from the Soviet Union and to those so-called republics after the failed communist coup of August 1991, which really was the death knell of the Soviet Union, which was gone then by Christmas Day. And the Republicans were upset about it. And now if you fast forward all the way to our times, just in the last year or so during the war, year or two, during the war in Ukraine, they talk about, what we need to do is decolonize Russia. We need to break up Russia all the way. That Bush Sr., not only was he a wimp who didn't want to destroy the Soviet Union, he was a wimp who didn't want to destroy the Russian Federation, which is what he should have done, is broken Russia itself into 15 more pieces that, of course, right, America could then dominate.
This is what you see through the course of this story. Each horrible step is followed by a worse one that wasn't even imagined at the time. And it's remarkable how many times the leaders of the Soviet Union, Russia, asked to join NATO. If you're going to keep NATO, let us in. But of course, if you were going to let them in, what would be the point of NATO? Which I don't think is a condemnation of the United Nations with all its deep flaws, or of the idea of international law, which I'm in support of. But international militarism, taking half the world and putting it into a giant military, whether Russia's in it or not, this is a disaster. And so it's very interesting that you talk about having been afraid of Russia getting in, because Russia not getting in, of course, has been the disaster that is the topic of the whole book, right?
Right. Well, that's why I'm a Ron Paul guy. We should have just abolished NATO and come home as soon as the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. I like to cite Pat Buchanan because, see, Ron Paul is, of course, a total non-interventionist. In the battle days of the Cold War in the late 70s, in the early 80s, during the brinksmanship of the early Reagan years, Ron Paul was for complete and total non-intervention, no matter what, right? But not Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan was a Reaganite. He had been Nixon's speechwriter, but really he was to the right of Nixon. He's a conservative nationalist and had been Reagan's speechwriter as well, and was an ardent Cold Warrior, and would argue, well, he's retired now, but would argue up to at least recent day that it was even the right thing to fight the war in Vietnam, to try to stop the communists there. He was a real believer in the war, in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But once the Soviet Union was gone, Pat Buchanan said, all right, now you guys promised we were only doing this whole world takeover thing to contain communism, the threat of world communism. But now that that's over, you have to live up to your promise. Now we abandon the empire and we become a constitutional republic again. I cite in there also Gene Kirkpatrick, who had been a legit neoconservative, meaning a leftist who had moved to the right and become a right-wing Reaganite militarist, but not only that, but was part of that set with Norman Podhoretz and the group, right? She was literally a neoconservative, one of the Gentile neoconservatives, of which there were, a few. She was a Presbyterian, I believe. But anyway, so she was a legit neoconservative. But then in 1990, before the Soviet Union was even gone, a year before the Soviet Union was even gone, but when the Cold War was officially dead and over, she said, hey, we should abandon the empire right now. Even with the USSR still standing, she said we should come home and be a normal country in a normal time, a normal nation in a world of normal nations, and we'll do our best to get along, and we'll be usually successful, and we'll be an open republic, and it'll be wonderful, and let's do that instead of this. And then the neoconservatives said, forget that. And well, it wasn't just the neoconservatives, because he had Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger and others who were absolutely not neoconservatives, but agreed with them about this stuff. But of course, the neocons are always the worst. The axis of crystal, as Justin Raimondo called it. You know, Bill Kristol and Charles Krauthammer, Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby and all of these nuts. And these guys said, oh no, Krauthammer said, we must stop short of nothing, we must stop short of nothing, stop at nothing short of universal domination. Sorry, I can't speak.
Right. No, this is what I love, these people who believe the propaganda, and then when the current propaganda excuse ends, they say, okay, let's stop the madness. I mean, you can see the US drive for global domination long predating the Soviet Union's existence, and a lot of it being, obviously phony during the Soviet Union's existence. And then the Soviet Union ends, and it, for most warmongers in the United States, it just continues unabated. But for some people, and when Osama bin Laden is finally killed, if that's really what happened, to a much lesser extent, you had people say, oh, okay, let's stop the madness now. But the excuse isn't the motivation. The motivation is the initial drive to global domination. But what I find very interesting, even though, it should be in the top of my head and I was alive at the time and so forth, the account in the book of the first Bush president not wanting Ukraine to even be independent and taking all kinds of positive steps toward peace with the Soviet Union that today would have him denounced as a traitor. I mean, there would be peeing prostitute tapes and the whole 9 yards if he did any of these things today. It was a very different time, right?
Yeah, well, what young people today wouldn't understand, I guess, is that I remember I was 14, 15, during this time at the end of the Soviet Union as it unraveled. And the thing of it was such a relief that the Cold War had come to an end. And, like they say, only Nixon can go to China. Well, only Ronald Reagan can shake hands with Gorbachev and say, hey there, little buddy, let's you and me work this out, in a way where a Democrat couldn't do that. Walter Mondale couldn't do that. Geraldine Ferraro, they weren't going to be able to do that. But Ronald freaking Reagan in his cowboy hat, he could. And same thing with Trump now. If Trump wants to go to Tehran and shake hands with the Ayatollah, what are they going to do? Call him a Democrat? The Democrats would not do that. Right. So only Nixon can go to China. In other words, any Republican can make peace if he plays macho enough while he does it. Right. And then so that even counted for W. Bush, who was known as a wimp. I mean, H.W. Bush, who was known as a wimp compared to Reagan. Right. Who was known as a centrist compared to Reagan. But when he came in and he had been the head of the CIA and had been ambassador to China, vice president for 8 years, he led us through a wonderful, wonderful war that everybody just loved so much in Iraq War I. And so he had the credibility to say, I am now taking all nuclear weapons off of naval surface ships. And I am now going to, in fact, I detail in there how, as he's running out of time to sign new nuclear treaties with Gorbachev, he ends up making unilateral cuts in nuclear weapons, including removing nuclear missiles from Navy surface ships,
right,
when he had no deal whatsoever, just based on the bet that, well, I hope that Gorbachev will reciprocate, because they had no time to negotiate it. And then Gorbachev did. Gorbachev then took his missiles off a high alert and did all of these things. So it's just the spirit of détente and friendship was around. It was there, and it feels lost now. It's really a shame.
But this
I
term
like to.
credibility, Scott, in U.S. foreign policy, credibility doesn't mean believable. It means warmongering, right? Massacres in Bangladesh and half the world sacrificed to make peace with China. And it's a peaceful thing, right? You have to be a warmonger. You have to go destroy Iraq if you want to be a peacemaker. Somehow we're going to have to get around that. We're going to have to be able to make peace and the next day also make peace, and
Right.
not be
And the dynamics are just terrible because, like I was saying, it takes a right winger like Nixon or Reagan to make a deal. Well, what's the opposite of that? It means liberal Democrats can't, especially women. They have to be muscular. They have to prove what tough guys they are. They have to campaign with Robert Kagan and Liz Cheney. And because they are just convinced, they just know it's like, it's so ingrained in them. It's impossible. It's like the sky is blue. They know that the worst thing about being a Democrat or a liberal or a woman is that you might be seen as weak on foreign policy. And the only answer to that is to let some blood. And meanwhile, out here in the real world, and never mind our current era, but like if you just go back a few years even like early Obama years or whatever, the idea, at least in the public perception, would have been that the Republicans are the hawks, and the reason that people vote for Democrats is the hope that they would be less worse. The hope, like Bill Clinton bombed Iraq for 8 years, but he didn't send in the 3rd Infantry Division like W. Bush and turn the whole thing upside down and give it to Iran and, the East to Iran and the West to Osama. I mean, so the idea out in the public is that might be why people would vote Democrat, why, for example, did Obama get the nomination over Hillary Clinton? It was mostly because he had opposed Iraq War II, and she ran
because he hadn't got there in time.
Yeah, and then
I think the polling, Scott, is very clear that Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris could have been president if they had said a few words in favor of peace.
That's right. And look, what did Hillary do? Once she got Secretary of State, she made Obama promise to first of all, she made him let her have her war in Libya and made him promise that he would support her to run in 2016. And she was going to run on Libya. This is only, a couple of years after he had just handed her ass for being a militarist, right? And she says, no, this is what I need to run in 2016 is to say, I'm the one. Unlike W. Bush, I know how to start a war and win it and do it right. Of course, by the time in 2016, she didn't want to talk about that anymore because Libya was a complete hellhole with al-Qaeda suicide bombers chopping heads off and literal chattel slavery, which still reigns to this day, by the way. The re-legalization, re-implementation of private chattel slavery in Libya has gone on to this day, 14 years now, since Obama's regime change and Hillary Clinton's regime change in that country. And this is how she got beat by Trump. What does she do when she's running against Trump? She goes, Trump wants to make peace with Russia. I want a no-fly zone. In other words, I want air-to-air dogfight combat with Russian MiGs to protect al-Qaeda terrorists on the ground. And Donald Trump said, did you hear that? I don't want that. And she lost. She lost. But she had in her head that, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to flip Arizona and I'm going to flip Texas. I'm going to turn them blue by going there and campaigning with Robert Kagan. And I'll have Robert Kagan, Victoria Nuland's wife, right. I'll have him come out. I said it on purpose this time. The first time I said that, it was a Freudian slip. Victoria Nuland's wife, I'll bring him to vouch for me, and Republicans will cross the aisle and vote Hillary if I only promise to be warmonger enough. And she ran on that in 2016 after the absolute catastrophe in Iraq, after the failure in Iraq had blown up into the caliphate and was now in the process of being destroyed again, right? When all the guys who had even believed in Iraq War II and fought in it and came home from it and still believed in it, now they had nothing to believe in. Now there was ISIS running roughshod over the entire western half of the country. The whole thing was obviously for nothing. And she's running on militarism because what? Otherwise they'll call her weak. Otherwise they'll call her a woman and say that the last thing we need is a woman who wants to bake cookies and make peace. We need a muscular militarist up there. And then, but she keeps losing, David. She keeps losing for that reason.
Of course, we need to call them weak for not making peace. We need to call them weak for not standing up to Lockheed Martin. We need to call Trump weak for not ending the war in Ukraine before his inauguration, as promised. And of course, the last war that they even claim was a victory, the elder Bush's war in Iraq, did not get him reelected. But the chunk of this book that I've gone through, which is tremendous, a big part of it, of course, is what people think of as the alleged promise not to expand NATO. But it was far more than alleged. You document it beautifully. And it was far more than one promise. They go on promising, lying, scamming, the whole Partnership for Peace scam. Can you talk a little bit about the relentless tricking of Russia?
Mm-hmm. Well, so from the very beginning, they knew that their plan for the long term was continued American domination of Europe. So in their high-minded thinking, to prevent France and Germany and Poland and Russia and Britain from jockeying over who's the dominant power in Europe, we will be the dominant power in Europe for now and forever. And so that will put an end to history there. And then that includes expanding into Eastern Europe. And they make the argument that, look, if Hungary and Slovakia both want to be in NATO, they can't have an ongoing border dispute. So everybody sit at a table, hash out exactly where everybody wants the border to be. We don't want to revise the borders after World War II. Do we, everybody? Okay, because you're going to be on American welfare if you'll just quell these minor territorial disputes between friendly nations now, right? And especially in the face of the old Soviet Union, everybody wanted to be friends with everybody but Russia, and especially with the United States. And so then that was the plan all along. But what they told the Soviets was, oh, no, we would never take advantage of your withdrawal and your abolition of the Warsaw Pact, and you're letting these nations leave the Warsaw Pact. That was Bush Sr. promised that long before James Baker ever said anything. Bush Sr. promised that at Malta in 1989. Now, the Hawks like to focus on one meeting one day between James Baker and Gorbachev on February the 9th, 1990. There were multiple meetings even that same day. Robert Gates made the same offer. He was Deputy National Security Advisor, made that same offer to the head of the KGB, showing that this had been the plan. They discussed it and planned it, and this was the offer. But the offer is a little complicated, but I'll explain it. The offer was, look, we promise if you'll allow reunification of Germany, we won't expand NATO into the eastern part of Germany. But then that didn't really make sense, because if it's really going to be reunified as one nation state, then obviously the whole nation is going to be in NATO. So what does that even mean? So they said, okay, well, here's what we mean, though. But what we'll do is we'll have a special military zone where we promise not to put substantial forces or nuclear weapons in Eastern Germany, in the former GDR. So, and that was what they eventually signed in the treaty. And of course, there are many verbal assurances on and on and on from Baker, from German Foreign Minister Genscher, from British Foreign Minister Hurd, and including Prime Minister Thatcher and Major in Britain, Chancellor Helmut Kohl in Germany, et cetera. Over and over and over, they made these promises and assurances. And then in the final treaty, they included this special military zone, which, if you look at it in context, the spirit of the thing, which is a thing that matters, right? I didn't just make up that term. The spirit of the treaty is they're still respecting their promise, essentially. They're saying, well, of course, the whole nation state is, quote unquote, in NATO as a category, right? But we're not moving our military forces substantially into the east. And they promised by name, of course, we're not bringing in the Baltics or Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. All of that obviously is out of the question. And the same understanding was, at least you could tell they were trying to respect it in spirit when they signed the Founding Act of 1997, which created the Russia-NATO Council, for one thing, but it also they promised that they would not, yes, we're going to bring Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into NATO. Czechoslovakia had split by then, but we're going to bring these three countries in, but we promise not to expand our military forces into these new nations, right? When Putin said, I want you to go back to 1997, like in the deal, that's the deal he was talking about. The Washington Post treated it like, and the rest of them treated it like this was some ancient deal from 1897. That what could he possibly be talking about that we would respect a promise that Bill Clinton made? Who's Bill Clinton? Wasn't he the president before Ike Eisenhower or something? I don't know. And forget that. But that was what he was talking about. And it showed that they still recognized that that was the promise that had been made. So they said, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and expand NATO, but we promise not to expand our military forces. So that goes to show that they knew that they had made the promise and that they had broken it. And as I show in the book, when the Russians brought this up to the Clinton people, they had the State Department went and did an internal investigation to find out if it was true or not. And they found out that it was true. And then they said, well, okay. And now listen, I think it's important to point out, as Ted Snyder at Antiwar.com points out, this wasn't just a promise. It was the basis of an agreement. It was on the basis, and Mary Elise Surratt points this out in her book, Not 1 Inch. It was on the basis of these assurances that Gorbachev agreed to allow the reunification of Germany. And
Scott, we've got about 2 minutes left, and we've gotten up to about page 10 of this 700-page book, Provoked by Scott Horton, which everyone needs to get. But, a lot of people look at NATO partners. They got partners across the globe now. But Russia, Belarus, they had to have their partnerships suspended. How did they get to become partners in the first place? And it was part of this scam of pretending to Russia that you weren't really expanding NATO. You were making some other countries semi-partners along with Russia, right?
Right. And see, a big part of that was saying, hey, look, NATO expansion is neither here nor there, as they used to say, because we're turning NATO into a political organization. See, it's going to be like the EU plus America. We're going to replace it as a military organization with this new partnership. Now, first they said we'll do it under the CSCE, which is now known as the OSCE. And later, as you mentioned, the Partnership for Peace in the Clinton years. And this was, again, the lie. This was a scam. You guys are going to be part of it with us. And get this. Look, if Russia joins at the same time, Ukraine and all these countries in the East join at the same time, then their neutrality is baked in. There's no need for America and Russia to ever tussle over who dominates Ukraine, because nobody does. It's a neutral country, and we're all part of the same security arrangement together. And so there's nothing at issue. And so that was the plan. That was how they sold it to the Russians over and over again, essentially to get them to acquiesce on various issues like allowing Poland to join NATO. Okay, fine. I guess if you guys promise that it's going to be a political organization and you're not really expanding your alliance, and you're going to, and in fact, Warren Christopher lied right to Yeltsin's face, and Yeltsin was, oh, this is brilliant. I love it. Tell Bill Clinton I'm so grateful. This is the best idea ever. I love you. I love you. I love you. And then 3 months later, they go, nah, we were just kidding. 4 months later, psych. We're actually, it's just a halfway house toward NATO expansion, and betrayed them over and over again.
Over and over and over again. And I'm only a little bit of the way through this wonderful book. I highly recommend it. Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine, by our guest, Scott Horton. Scott, thank you for everything you've been doing and for coming on Talk World Radio.
Thank you so much, David. Keep reading. You're in there.
This is Talk World Radio. I'm David Swanson. Take action at rootsaction.org. Help end war at worldbeyondwar.org. Read or listen to today's Peace Almanac entry at peacealmanac.org. All past shows can be heard at talkworldradio.org. Talk World Radio is produced in Charlottesville, Virginia, and syndicated by Pacifica Network. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way.